questions like who am I, or any of the spiritual mysteries, even in principle, cannot be solved. By solved, I mean that now we have a mental description of this. That is what we understand by solution of something. And on the other hand, if one stays with any of these mysteries, they influence the whole of one's life. And I'll give you an example of this specifically. Some of you, I'm sure all of you probably have heard of the great poet Rabindranath Tagore. 3 countries have their national anthems based on his poetry. So it's hardly, and he got a Nobel Prize in Literature in 1919. Just 13 days before he died, he wrote a very short poem in Bengali. That's his mother tongue, but I will say this in English. In the beginning of my life, with the first rays of the rising sun, I asked, who am I? Now, at the end of my life, with the last rays of the setting sun, I ask, who am I? The mystery remains, but without question, it very much influenced him. He was a poet, a dancer, a singer, a musician. Towards the end of his life, he started learning physics also. I mentioned this. Quite an absolutely remarkable human being. But as he says, the mystery still remains. But my wish is that this book, for anybody who is interested in reading it, this book would invite them to explore the mysteries in their own life. What has brought them to where they are? Why were they born where they were born? Why should they have the parents they have, the parents? Because all that has very large influence on their life. The way we think, or the language we learn, the scriptures we study, all this is so much influenced by it. For example, all the scriptures that I have mentioned, because I grew up in India, I naturally was exposed to them. You people probably were not exposed to them. You will be exposed to other scriptures. At least in Canada, I imagine this is true in USA also. We have holidays at Christmas and Easter, not when the Buddha was enlightened. So it influences the children right away, right from practically early in the school, all the various things that go on. So I invite you to explore the mysteries in your own life.
We used to have a center in Boulder, but that's no longer there. We draw from a wide assortment of both ancient wisdom and leading-edge studies in science and consciousness and spirituality and philosophy. We are now in our 20th year. We started in 2003 at our center in Boulder, but it wasn't until 2020 that we began recording our presentations on Zoom. Our video recordings, and we have over 100, are viewable through our website, caritascenter.org, and also on our YouTube channel, which is Caritas Consciousness Project. And as a nonprofit organization, we rely on the support of our members and donors to keep our program going. So if you'd like to support our program, we appreciate it very much. You can make a donation on any page of the website, or you could become a member on the membership page. And now let me introduce tonight's guest speaker. Let me see here. Ravi Ravindra is an author and professor emeritus at Dalhousie University in Halifax. And that's in Nova Scotia, Canada, where he served. He's where he served as a professor in comparative religion, philosophy, and physics. He was a member of the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton, a fellow of the Indian Institute of Advanced Study in Shimla, and the founding director of the Threshold Award for Integrative Knowledge. He is the author of many books, including the ones that I had listed on the flyer, and including this one, which he will be talking about tonight, Blessed by Mysterious Grace. And it's a wonderful book. I want to read you a review that David Lorimer, who presented for us last Saturday, gave on Ravi's book, on this particular book. He said, Ravi Ravindra has written one of the great spiritual autobiographies of our time, vividly evoking significant conversations with his principal teachers, including the great Jeanne de Salzmann, and the precious insights they conveyed to him. The book is spiced with instructive and entertaining anecdotes about the many interesting people who have crossed his path. Above all, though, it is the story of a lifelong quest to answer the question, who am I? Essentially not at the level of the socially constructed ego. Readers are invited into a corresponding journey with themselves and are challenged to live a truly authentic life that makes a small contribution to the evolution of consciousness and life energy. To fall short in this task is to waste the precious gift of a human life. Truly inspiring and essential reading. So that's what David Lorimer, those of you who watched him last week, that's what he said about that book. And I really enjoyed reading it. So, Ravi, would you like to, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for giving us your time this evening. And would you like to tell us a little bit give us a little background on this book, or whatever you want to say to start us off?
Yes. Well, first of all, I actually had titled this book as Blessed by Undeserved Grace. But the publishers did not like that idea. Because I personally don't really realize or feel that I actually deserved all this. Some of the very remarkable people spent so much time and attention on me, I can hardly believe it. And a few of them actually I met even before knowing who they were. For example, Krishnamurti, when I first met him, I did not know who he was. Mm-hmm. Or a great Zen master, Chulung Sunim, I did not know. And similarly, Jeanne de Salzmann, mm-hmm. I did not know who she was. So I am absolutely amazed that I should meet these people and then they should spend so much time and energy on me. Mm-hmm. In fact, I was a little hesitant writing this, but some friends of mine, especially two friends in India, are very keen. They were very eager to publish it.
Uh-huh.
Still some people are coming, so they think it's ringing in the background.
I'm sorry, just ignore it if you can.
Oh, that's fine. Now, first of all, I should maybe even alert various people here. If you wish to have a copy of this book, it's better to write to us. It's much more expensive via Amazon. This is just the way it is. And the book was published in India, and shipping costs much more than the cost of the book, surprisingly.
Uh-huh.
Now, really, first of all, I should mention that even right from childhood, somehow I often ask myself, or even ask my father, why have I been created? This seemed to me to be a question that was not answered by anybody. I don't think I can answer it even now, but the mystery deepens more and more. And one of the remarks that there were several, of course, being brought up in India, one gets exposed to many scriptural remarks here, there by people. And the Youth Hostels Association at that time used to have a motto called, "Wandering one gathers honey." This was their motto of the youth hostel. It actually comes from an old scriptural text, Atriya Upanishad, but I don't need to go into the details of that. So for me personally, this itself was rather interesting. How do I wander? What does it mean, wandering one? Does it simply mean walking around? Or does it mean actually connecting with people or different teachings or traditions, which is what eventually it really led me to connect with. So wandering one gathers honey, even academically, none of my friends can really believe it, that I ended up teaching courses in physics, in philosophy, in religion, just because I was academically also wandering, not really satisfied by any of these disciplines. And another remark, again coming from a very old text, if you're interested, it's Shatapat Brahmana, which said, right at birth, one owes a debt to the sages, debt to the society, debt to the parents. All that makes perfect sense. But for me, partly coming from wandering one gathers honey, I said, are the sages only of Indian origin? Don't I owe debt to Christ or to Socrates? Or especially having a bit of a scientific perspective, I regarded people like Einstein and Newton also as sages, as far as I was concerned. The word sage can mean many things. So why don't I owe debt to them? So this was a question for me, really right from the early on in my life, but very much arising from very scriptural kind of remarks in the Indian tradition. Another thing, maybe most of you already know that, but if you like, I can give just a few remarks on it. What gets called Hinduism has nothing to do with any language from India, the word Hindu or India. Does everybody know this, or shall I take a minute to speak about this a little bit?
I thought that was very interesting. Why don't you tell us about it?
Well, there is a river called Sindhu, which was the dividing river between the Persian Empire and the Indian kingdoms. And even now, if you know any people from Iran, but certainly earlier, they pronounce sa as ha. So they pronounce the river Sindhu as Hindu. And then the land on the other side, this is in Persian, Hindustan, meaning land of the Hindus. So anybody who lives on the other side of this river is a Hindu from their perspective. And then when it was written in Greek, H is written but is not pronounced. Then it became Indus. So we have something called the Indus River, from which we get the word India. It has nothing to do with any Indian language. And secondly, then it became very difficult for people to describe what is a Hindu. In 1881, the British who were ruling India took the general public census. And obviously, from the ruler's point of view, it was important to have religious conflicts. So they wanted people to describe their religion. So one could describe whether one is a Christian or a Muslim. But when it came to describing who is a Hindu, they had no idea who is a Hindu. Then this is the definition given by the English. And it is still in the Constitution of India, believe it or not. A Hindu is an Indian who is not a Christian or a Muslim. That's the definition of a Hindu in the Constitution of India, given by the British. A Hindu is an Indian who is not a Christian nor a Muslim. But according to the so-called Hindus themselves, what they refer to their religion is Sanatan Dharma, literally meaning eternal law. So from that perspective, anybody who is in fact able to correspond to the eternal law is automatically a Hindu. For example, Christ or Rumi. They're automatic from the perspective of the Hindu understanding of what is Sanatana Dharma. So you see, it's important for people to understand that these words have just been attached. In fact, right now in India, the government of India is trying to remove the name India because this doesn't correspond to anything in India coming from the Indian tradition. They wish to use a very traditional name called Bharat. I don't want to go into more details of this. It may not succeed, but that's their effort right now in India. And so let me, in any case, come back to just mentioning a few little items, but please feel free to raise any questions or challenge anything. First of all, especially immediately after India became independent in 1947, there was a very strong emphasis that if you are a good student, which basically meant if you are getting good marks, really, that's all it means, being a good student, then you should definitely go studying technology. And a new institute had just been started in India based on the MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology in USA, called IIT, Indian Institute of Technology. And it was just expected if you're a good student, that's where you would apply to go there. You may or may not get admitted. That's a different, because there are thousands of people applying. Very few people get admitted. And it may be difficult for you people to believe this, but it is actually the truth. It may be now changing a little bit, but certainly for the last 60, 70 years, if you're studying history or philosophy or anything in the humanities, that basically means you're not a good student from an Indian point of view. I'm just telling you the background. It's good for you to know all this. It may surprise you. It is true, on the other hand, that people who end up going into studying technology, etc., some of them, perhaps including myself, still have certain spiritual searches, so they can gradually, therefore, move away from technology to other subjects, as I did myself, moving towards philosophy, then realizing that the philosophers are just interested only in arguing with each other, not really interested in having any kind of a perception of truth. So actually, philosophy was the one thing that really completely put me off from whatever I saw. In our own university, you may not believe it, there was a course in the philosophy department called How to Win an Argument. That was the title of a course in the philosophy department. This seems to be their main interest, as far as I can see, how to win an argument. So then I shifted to religion, but sadly, at least in my experience, most professors of religion are not religious in nature. To everything that I'm saying, there are exceptions, because I could also mention one or two people, highly regarded scholars in religion, who at least tried and wished to be also very religious. Some of you would probably even know these names. Houston Smith is an example. Wilford Cantwell Smith is another example. So there are exceptions to everything that I'm saying, but I'm speaking about it as a kind of a general thing here. Then somehow meeting some of the people, sometimes accidentally, not realizing who I was actually meeting, gradually beginning to understand that there is something to do with the quality of being of the person that is much more important. Not how much they know. Some of the great sages, for example, Raman Maharshi, I'm almost certain, could not quote many texts from anything in the Indian scripture than anywhere else. In fact, some of you probably know the only book he actually ever read was the Bible. He did not read any other book, even from the Indian scriptures. And similarly, the kind of knowledge we are speaking about, I'm sure the Buddha could not fix my computer if it broke down. That's not the kind of knowledge we're talking about. This is the quality of their being, by which I mean now quality of their consciousness and the compassion or love more or less oozing out of them. Because this is the nature of ultimate reality described by all the sages. And if they are connected with higher level of being, which basically really essentially means connected closer and closer to God. If you don't like this word, you can use some other words like Brahma, or Allah, or the Absolute, or simply that. And because the word God, spirit, soul, etc., have been so thoroughly corrupted by the religious people, they mean by it whatever the hell they want to mean by it. And just imagine everybody has an eternal soul. It all sounds very nice without having to do any work at all. So I think one needs to be really questioning all of these words, and certain other words get used to replace them sometimes. In any case, returning to what I wanted to say, that any of the sages who certainly struck me very much had a quality of being, by which I mean in their presence one felt listened to, and radiation from them somehow elevating something in one's own quality of being, at least temporarily, in their presence. And then, as I said, if we were to say that the Buddha was enlightened but was not compassionate, that will be an oxymoron. One cannot be enlightened without being compassionate. Similarly, Christ. If he is in fact one with God, love naturally oozes out of him, because love is said to be one of the characteristics of God. For example, those of you who may be interested, first letter of John, twice he repeats, God is love. Not God is loving. That is a different meaning. But to say God is love is to speak about the very structure of God. Similarly, expressions about truth, love, and beauty are very often associated with whatever we understand by God. Of course, the words vary from place to place. Another thing I like to remind all my friends, and even the audience here now, every religion says God is omnipresent. If we don't dismiss this, remember God is right behind you, in front of you, all around you, inside you. Everything that we do is under the gaze of God. Otherwise, we are just dismissing what all the religions say. I'm making some very simple remarks, but on the other hand, I call people again and again to really think about these things seriously. It's very easy to say God is omnipresent, but what the hell does it mean in practice? And so for me, these kinds of issues really became my life's mission. Why have I been created by whatever forces have created me? It's clearly obvious. I did not create myself any more than you created yourself. And we keep using expression, I am breathing. This is crazy. Did I create this breathing apparatus? Or the air that I need to breathe to stay alive? If we don't dismiss the scriptures, for example, the book of Genesis, this is a remark I'm quoting to you from the book of Genesis. God created human beings from the earth, then he breathed his own breath into them to make them alive. As long as I am alive or you are alive, it's the breath of God that is keeping us alive. Now we can dismiss all this if we like, but that's personally for me, that does not lead me to understand anything. It may well be that this remark is not clear to me or I don't really understand it. But if I dismiss it, then I'll never understand it. But if I at least say it is worth listening to, worth staying with, struggling to understand this, are these sages just foolish? Should I just dismiss Christ or the Buddha, or why? I have met many Nobel Prize winner scientists. I can assure you many of them you would not want to invite home for tea. Their quality of being is very, very poor. Not everybody's. Some of them are quite remarkable people also. I don't want to indicate to you that every Nobel Prize winner is in that category. But just because one has a great knowledge, has won a Nobel Prize, doesn't mean that the quality of their being is high. What we are speaking about here in spiritual search is really the quality of their being. Jeanne de Salzmann, who was really the person in charge of whole of Gurdjieff teaching after Gurdjieff died in 1949, until her own death at 101 in 1990, she was the most remarkable human being I have encountered personally. And so when I was trying to write some things that I had heard from her or some of my meetings, immediately the title of the book that came to my mind was Heart Without Measure. That's the title of my book, writing about her, because that's exactly what she had. A very subtle combination of wisdom and love. Similarly, to the extent that I can recall, I had many meetings with Krishnamurti, same kind of feeling about him, obviously expressed differently. One should also realize that each teaching has its own starting point. For example, in the Krishnamurti circles, right away, you're not expected to have any kind of meat or alcohol. In the Gurdjieff circles, nobody cares what you have. You begin from where you are, gradually to discover what it is that you really need rather than what you should just automatically have. But I say some of these things, but one of the things I also wanted to say, I mentioned in this book, much to my surprise, one of the very great Zen master in South Korea. I had never heard of him personally. I wasn't trying to meet him or anything like this, but many forces, circumstances arranged so that we end up meeting him. In fact, some of these things, the first meeting I had with him, people may not even believe it, except that Priscilla Marie was there, and also my previous wife was there with me. So we were trying to escape a little crowd at a monastery and decided to go up the mountain, just walking up the mountain, really to escape the crowd more than that. And we had been before that visiting several Buddhist monasteries on the advice of somebody in Korea, South Korea. Lovely monasteries. And everywhere we went, there were detailed tea ceremonies. And my wife was rather addicted to coffee, and for the last 3 or 4 days, she had been missing coffee. So as we went up this mountain, in the background, somebody says in the background, would somebody like a cup of coffee? No. As you can well imagine, we could hardly say no. Gradually, we discover, actually later on, not that day, that he was the most exalted Zen master in Korea. The president of Korea was his disciple, the admiral of Korea was his disciple, etc. But we had no idea of this. But that he had taken a vow to be on that mountain for, I think, 19 years or something. He had also come to USA, actually had some disciples in USA. And probably that's why he could speak enough English. Certainly his English was hell of a lot better than our Korean or anything like this. So he actually spoke to us in English and first of all said, would somebody like a cup of coffee? Then, of course, it was not Starbucks coffee, obviously. He sent his sidekick to get some coffee powder, puts hot water in it, and is about to hand a cup of coffee to my wife. Suddenly he says, do you realize that all the tea ceremonies went to Japan from Korea? Mm-hmm. I will show you the real tea ceremony. So he pushes away the cup of coffee and shows us the real tea ceremony again. Elaborate tea ceremony. But then, as we are about to leave, he saddens his sidekick, who brings an envelope, which he gives it to me. And any of you who have been to India, you know, if you go to a temple, etc., you make some offering to the image of Krishna or Rama or something. And when you're leaving, often they give you some little food or something to eat as what is called prasad, a kind of a benediction. So I just assumed that it was something like that. So I asked him if I should open it. He said, if you wish. So I opened it, and it had 7 $100 US notes in it. And he said, this is the only foreign exchange available, meaning otherwise he would have given me more. And then he said, this is to pay for your next visit. As I said, nobody would believe it other than the 2 other people were there with me. Of course, I did not want to take this money from there. We ended up buying some ancient works of art from Korea, and actually ended up costing more than this amount of money. But that's a separate issue. Then, about a year and a half later, I went there again. And he was a great aficionado of art. Actually, in his room, which he showed us, there were 2 16th, 17th century paintings, lovely paintings. And so my impression is that any art seller who had a great work of art they wanted to sell, they would bring it to him. And if he wanted to get it, one of his many disciples would happily pay for it. He wasn't doing a job or earning money, etc. But so on one occasion, so we were together there for about 10 days. We will start sitting in the meditation early in the morning, about 3 a.m., sit until 7 a.m., then have a little break for breakfast, etc., and then sit again practically all day. And on one occasion, or one of those days, a professor of physics from a neighboring university also came with his wife, joined us for meditation for about 2 hours or so. And an art dealer had just got an image of the Buddha from the 10th century, from the one of the dynasty there, which had disappeared in the 10th century. And he was happy to sell it to me. He was just eager to sell it rather than anything else. So he wanted $15,000 for it. And this physics professor spoke on my behalf and talked him down to $14,000, but no less. And just before I had gone there, I had actually the Templeton Foundation, some of you may know, the Templeton Foundation had given me an award for $10,000 for some course I was teaching. So I thought, well, I'll be happy to give this $10,000 and buy this nice image of the Buddha. But he wouldn't come down below 14,000. So next morning, this great Zen master, Chulung Sunim was his name, comes to my little cottage where I was staying, and his sidekick is carrying a lovely image of the Buddha. In fact, I have an image of the Buddha right here behind me. And he insisted on giving it to me. He said, I understand that you're interested in having an image of the Buddha. You should take this. First of all, if something is more than 100 years old, you know, it's international law requires a written permission from the government to get out of the country. You people may not know this, but this is actually the law. Anything more than 100 years old. So I said to him that they won't let me take it out of the country. So he sent somebody to put a piece of paper in Korean, but he translated it for me. I have given this to my friend Ravi Ravindra. Please do not interfere. That's what he said he had written. And this was a cast iron Buddha image, and it is ringing bells everywhere when I go. But interestingly, the security people at the airport actually bowed to it. They didn't challenge or ask me anything. They simply bowed to it and let me go. But I say that he insisted that he has to give me this image because I had done something for him in a previous life. Now, reincarnation, as you know, is a very standard idea in the whole of the Indian tradition. And when I say the Indian tradition, of course, Buddhism, as a great scholar has written, Buddhism is Hinduism for export. It's basically because otherwise you have to live in India to be called a Hindu by definition. So the image of the Buddha given to me because I had done something in a previous life for him. As I said, the notion of reincarnation is absolutely standard in the whole of the Indian tradition. But maybe most of you know that even in the Christian tradition, until the 6th century, reincarnation was a part of the tradition. It was only in the 6th century, Emperor Justinian, which is now in Turkey, the headquarters of the Eastern Orthodox Church, he was the one eager to remove this from the Christian tradition, simply because otherwise in successive reincarnations, people will come closer and closer to God, and therefore they would not ask for any salvation by Christ. That Christ is a savior is exclusively a Christian idea. Nobody in India would say Buddha is a savior or Krishna is a savior. They are teachers, inviting you to learn something, to practice something. But in any case, so he was, even the Pope at that time very much believed in reincarnation, but the emperor incarcerated him, forced him to declare this as a heresy. You can read this in British Encyclopedia or anywhere else, what I'm speaking about. So this was very much a part of the Christian tradition until the 6th century. And Origen, a great Christian, actually an early highly regarded church father, later on he was also declared a heretic because of this. He very much believed in reincarnation as well. And so in any case, what I really more wished for you people to not to be stuck with, I am absolutely amazed by all the blessings that have been given to me. But what I would like you people to consider, what are the mysteries running your own life? Because according to all the spiritual teachers, there is a purpose for our existence. And how that purpose can be fulfilled, unless right from the birth, I have certain attitudes, certain qualities, certain wishes. How do I get them? So I really ask you, for example, let us say, if it is true what the sages say, that everybody has a purpose right from birth. So my daughter also has a purpose. If I had gone to, let us say, gone to Germany, I might have married a German woman rather than being in Canada marrying a Canadian woman. Then my daughter will be different. So does it mean that the purpose of my daughter's life actually makes guaranteed that I do certain things in my life? I go to certain places. I go to only to Canada, not to Germany. I'm asking you to consider this. What are the mysteries running your own life? Why was I born in India and then moving to Canada? Why were you born where you were born? One could say these are just stupid questions. But according to all the sages, please take my word for it, you can read it here, there is a purpose to our existence, and things are not just randomly organized. The universe is being run by very great forces, not just randomly happening. Then one needs to ask, what are the mysteries conducting, helping, interfering in your own life? Even the fact where you were born, some of us are smarter than the others, some are less smarter, right from birth. It's not something you decide to be. Why? Why should you be so smart? I raised some of these questions because personally for me, meeting these, first of all, reading some of the great scriptures and the remarks of the great spiritual sages, and then meeting some quite remarkable people, have actually deepened a sense of mystery rather than that now I know the answers to these mysteries. The question becomes deeper and deeper. What am I? And why am I here? And here I should also maybe remind you, then I will stop and invite you to bring any questions if you wish. Or actually, Gloria and I were having a conversation earlier. She has many questions to ask me. That questions like, who am I, or any of the spiritual mysteries, even in principle, cannot be solved. By solved, I mean that now we have a mental description of this. That is what we understand by solution of something. And on the other hand, if one stays with any of these mysteries, they influence the whole of one's life. And I'll give you an example of this specifically. Some of you, I'm sure all of you probably have heard of the great poet Rabindranath Tagore. 3 countries have their national anthems based on his poetry. So it's hardly, and he got a Nobel Prize in Literature in 1919. Just 13 days before he died, he wrote a very short poem in Bengali. That's his mother tongue, but I will say this in English. In the beginning of my life, with the first rays of the rising sun, I asked, who am I? Now, at the end of my life, with the last rays of the setting sun, I ask, who am I? The mystery remains, but without question, it very much influenced him. He was a poet, a dancer, a singer, a musician. Towards the end of his life, he started learning physics also. I mentioned this. Quite an absolutely remarkable human being. But as he says, the mystery still remains. But my wish is that this book, for anybody who is interested in reading it, this book would invite them to explore the mysteries in their own life. What has brought them to where they are? Why were they born where they were born? Why should they have the parents they have, the parents? Because all that has very large influence on their life. The way we think, or the language we learn, the scriptures we study, all this is so much influenced by it. For example, all the scriptures that I have mentioned, because I grew up in India, I naturally was exposed to them. You people probably were not exposed to them. You will be exposed to other scriptures. At least in Canada, I imagine this is true in USA also. We have holidays at Christmas and Easter, not when the Buddha was enlightened. So it influences the children right away, right from practically early in the school, all the various things that go on. So I invite you to explore the mysteries in your own life. That's my wish. But you're welcome to have a copy of this book if you wish, but write to me rather than going through Amazon. It's more expensive there. Yeah. Okay, anybody? So Gloria, you had several questions earlier you asked me.
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I'll start with the concept of mysterious grace, the title of your book, Blessed by Mysterious Grace. So is central to your book. And I wanted to see how you would define the term. Is all grace mysterious? And what role does it play in one's spiritual transformative journey, would you say? And what is grace?
It's an important question. I think I mentioned earlier that I was actually titling the book as Blessed by Undeserved Grace.
Yes.
Mysterious, first of all, that I don't really understand why I should be blessed by this. Mysterious both in that sense, and also more and more as I think about it, feeling of mystery actually enhances my search.
Mm-hmm.
Something that one easily figures out doesn't it doesn't require any more search or research.
Mm-hmm.
So I think experiencing a feeling of something mysterious has an effect on one's life, that it enhances search. In fact, even sometimes word mysterious gets, for example, mythology, or mentioning things which are not so historically verifiable or intellectually verifiable. Even the great philosopher Aristotle made this remark: when philosophy is unable to connect with reality, one takes recourse to mythology.
Look at it.
So you see, in a way, one needs to return to mythology or mystery when one is not able to figure it out in the usual rational sense. And on the other hand, the suggestion is that is closer to richness of truth rather than those things that we can figure out intellectually.
Mm-hmm.
Because all the great sages have repeatedly emphasized limitations of the mind. In fact, a very strong suggestion in every spiritual teaching that there are many levels of reality subtler than the mind. In fact, personally, I feel that is almost the very meaning of the word spiritual. If something is spiritual, it cannot be figured out by the mind. For example, but on the other hand, the realm of spirituality is very large. In the Bible, we have 9 orders of angels. They're all spiritual, different levels of spirituality. And therefore, the idea that mystery or mythology is speaking about reality subtler than the mind, which is why in any serious meditation, for example, anybody reading Yoga Sutras, practically the first substantial sutra is yoga is stopping all the movements of the mind. That's the second sutra in the first chapter of the Yoga Sutras, by the way. Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Some of you may know this in Sanskrit. Yoga is stopping all the movements of the mind. That is the call. Precisely because the mind is really dealing with a level of reality which is lower than whatever we understand by something spiritual. That's why so your question about mystery, for me, this is the domain it opens.
Yes. But what about grace? How would you define grace? Is it like a gift? I think of grace as a gift that I haven't earned, that opens, it's like a portal that opens to allow for some kind of understanding, spiritual understanding that just comes.
That is true.
Or an event.
All of the words have subtle variations in their meanings. As you know, particularly in the whole of the Christian theological tradition, there has been much debate really between effort and grace. Martin Luther, just to remind you people here quickly, was partly because he was so annoyed with the churches asking for more and more money to be given to the churches. That was the effort, which will then get them to heaven. So he reacted very much against it. And he actually insisted that the Holy Spirit cannot be forced by any effort on your part. Doesn't matter what you do. It all depends only on grace. In fact, most of my Lutheran friends don't want to quote this, but this is his remark, not my remark. Therefore, sin bravely. This is Luther, Martin Luther. Therefore, sin bravely. He said that before he married Nun Kate, but that's my impression. But really, from his point of view, it doesn't matter what you do. It's all up to the grace of the Holy Spirit. My own personal impression, both in my own life and anybody else that I have actually encountered, whom I have met, that it is true that ultimately it all really comes from the other side. It is a matter of grace. But something is required from our side to become receptive. Otherwise, for example, my own teacher, Jeanne de Salzmann, actually said that God is more eager to connect with me than I am eager to connect with God, but that I'm running away. I'm not letting him connect with me. Mm-hmm. So something is required from my side to allow God to touch me, to connect with me. And maybe here this might interest you. This is actually a remark of Einstein, hardly a negligible scientist. He was periodically asked. Now, of course, they use slightly different words. He was asked, is creativity a matter of chance or is it a matter of hard work? And his response is very interesting. And really, in a way, I'm trying to emphasize that. Einstein's response was, creativity is ultimately a matter of chance, but chance seems to favor the prepared. Mm-hmm. So what is required from our side? Am I prepared enough to allow this chance to assist me or to reveal itself to me? Mm-hmm. This used to be one of the emphasis of Krishnamurti as well. Actually, he would, on one occasion, he said to me, all this effort business, the sun is shining. All you need to do is to open the window. Mm-hmm. But I said to him that some windows are painted shut. They need to be scraped. Mm-hmm. So it depends really where one is. One needs to see. Mm-hmm. Something is required from our side to become more and more receptive. Yeah. That doesn't mean that I can grab what God may bring. No. But am I willing to receive it or am I running away? If the sun is shining, but I keep my doors closed, curtains drawn, it's not going to get in. Right? So something is required from our side. But to more and more to acknowledge that all great insight, actually, every major scientist would agree with this. Certainly, Newton very much agrees with this. Einstein, these are the two of the greatest scientists in the history of humanity. And many of the poets would all agree with what I'm just saying, that their insights came from the other side. But of course, they were prepared enough. They knew enough mathematics or enough whatever was required for them to be able to express that. Otherwise, in fact, this might amuse some of you to know, Einstein, with his special theory of relativity, where he actually shows how matter and energy are very much connected with each other, he sent that paper for publication. On the way home from the post office, he's still thinking about it. This is when, on the way home, he comes to this idea that E is equal to mc square. Energy is equal to mass multiplied by velocity of light squared. This was not originally in that paper, but it is still continuing with him. On the way back from the post office, he comes to this insight.
Yeah. I loved what the quote that you have in your book from Helena Blavatsky of the Theosophy movement. She said, there are some people who are Theosophists, but are not members of the Theosophical Society. Yes. And there are some members of the Theosophical Society who are not Theosophists. And I love that. I would say that applies to every tradition, right? Yes. What she meant by that.
Well, you know the background of that I mentioned in that book. This was, I believe, now I have to get my dates sorted up. I think 1993 or 91, something like that. The International Theosophical Society was having their gathering in Brazil, actually. And Ratha Bernier, who was the president of the International Theosophical Society, had invited me to give a keynote talk there. And some Theosophists were annoyed with this idea because I was not even a member of the Theosophical Society. So they asked her, why did she invite me? Because I'm not even a member. This is when she read that the next day, this remark of Madame Blavatsky.
It certainly applied.
That was the background of it.
It struck me as I read your book that it was like you were the common denominator of many religious traditions.
Well,
right. So your book explores various spiritual traditions and philosophies. How would you say these diverse traditions intersect? What common threads have you discovered in your studies, in your research, and your experiences with each of these traditions?
Well, first of all, of course, having grown up in India and then living in Canada for many years now, in Canada, obviously, as I said, it's at Christmas and Easter that we get holidays. Everybody here calls themselves a Christian, or most people call themselves Christians. These are just labels, you realize that. There are 2.5 billion Christians. I keep asking how many of them are actually following what Christ actually taught. That's a different matter, but it's the same thing.
Jesus was not a Christian.
Same thing is true in every other religion. This remark is not meant to be anything against Christianity, especially.
Exactly.
Absolutely same thing is true. If, for example, Hindus would say they are connected with the eternal law, Sanatana Dharma. How many of them are connected with any damn eternal law? Just to remind you, 40% of the elected parliamentarians in India now have criminal records against them. And they all have names like Rama and Krishna. So it's the same thing absolutely everywhere. No, it's the tragedy, actually. But that aside, that's really not the main point. But the idea that since I was in Canada, personally to me, it seems rather obvious that every culture, even the music that people listen to, scriptures that they read, etc., is influenced by the major religion in that culture. It could hardly be otherwise. So since I was in Canada, I wished to learn something about Christianity. And I was particularly struck by the Gospel of John, especially. Later on, ended up writing a book about that, called The Yoga of the Christ, which has actually touched many, many Christians. In fact, even one of the cardinals in the Vatican has written to me about it. And Bishop of London, who officiates on these royal marriages, etc., he wrote to me saying it brought a breath of fresh air. But then he said he doesn't agree with everything I say.
That was the book you presented on last time, but unfortunately it didn't get recorded.
Yeah.
But that was a beautiful presentation.
But in any case, the point I more wanted to make that, of course, there were some organizations dealing with Christianity who were very eager to convert me to Christianity so that I can get to heaven. Otherwise, there is no possibility. So I sometimes feel very sad for the Buddha, because according to all the Christians, he's just suffering in hell, right?
Not according to all of them.
Well, I sometimes wonder, but that's what they say.
Yeah, well.
And in any case, I was very soon very disheartened with what goes on in the churches, etc. But there are obviously very great sages in the Christian tradition who have written some of the things. Like, actually, many of my Christian friends don't even know these texts. For example, Theologia Germanica is an extraordinary text. Actually, Martin Luther, in fact, said that a Christian needs to read only 3 books: Letter to the Romans by St. Paul, and John of the Cross, Gospel of John, and Theologia Germanica. This is Martin Luther's remark. And then, for example, another very classical text, in my judgment, is Cloud of Unknowing, written by an English author, but nobody really knows who exactly it is, but obviously an English one. Theologia Germanica, originally in German. Then we have other books like Imitatio Christi, Imitation of Christ, written very early on. Many other Philokalia. There are very remarkable texts written by very great sages who actually practiced something and experienced something. Meister Eckhart, John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, they are absolutely remarkable sages anywhere in the world. And so personally, from my point of view, increasingly we need to see that we are in a global culture. If you look at 6 or 7 major companies now, Google, Microsoft, many of them are being run by CEOs of Indian origin or Chinese origin. It's a very global culture. And in fact, according to this Pew Research Center in USA, I've forgotten the exact date, but I think in the next 15 or 20 years, half of the population in USA, according to them, will be of mixed races. I say that simply to point out that we are increasingly in a global culture. So I may come from a Hindu background, but isn't there anything I can learn from a Christian sage or a Muslim sage? And vice versa. And one of the things that, I often actually speak about, there are many things which are common to all the traditions, but there are some major differences. But the differences are in the expression of the traditions, which is to say, differences are in what the philosophers say or the theologians say about it. They are not in the experiences of the sages. In fact, some of you may know this. We had a very great sage in India called Ramakrishna at the end of the 19th century. He was teacher of Vivekananda, for example. Some of you may know more people know the name of Vivekananda than they know of Ramakrishna. Ramakrishna, obviously from the so-called Hindu background, intentionally undertook to practice Christian teaching and on another occasion, Islamic teaching. And he came to this conclusion that they actually lead to the same peak. Now, personally, for me, I cannot say that from my experience, that they lead to the same peak. I don't get to that peak. But it is difficult to dismiss somebody like Ramakrishna who actually experienced these things and could say that. Personally, from my point of view, intellectually, it makes more sense to me that there are different ladders that can take us to the top of the roof. There doesn't have to be just one ladder that goes there.
Of course.
Hmm?
Right. Roshi Kobori, am I saying that right?
Yes.
Roshi Kobori said, "It is not to unite two things, science and religion, for instance, but to realize their original oneness."
Yes.
I really liked that.
Yes.
So I thought, well, instead of referring to the convergence of science and spirituality, we can observe how each is discovering their common origin, not just like in medieval times when the church dictated science, but in terms of timeless mystical experience and quantum physics.
No, it is true. In fact, I remember on one occasion saying to Krishnamurti that he is a scientist of the interior. You see, what actually happened, maybe if you don't mind, slight background here. The major contribution that modern science, starting in the 16th century, 17th century, tried to bring was to point out that not only the theory, but actual observations are also important. That was really the major contribution. But people may not believe it. You can look at the history. All the problems between religion and science have been created by organized religions, not by anybody coming from the scientific side. Giordano Bruno came up with the idea of what these days we would call exoplanets, that there are other planets elsewhere. He was burnt at the stake because that would mean that Christ would have to be in several different planets, but Christ is unique, blah, blah. And then Descartes, I'm just mentioning 4 or 5 major scientists of that time. All of them were condemned by the religion people. Descartes was poisoned by a Catholic priest because there was a concern that he may get more interested in Lutheran or Klein notions. Galileo was incarcerated, and Spinoza, little later on, probably the most important Jewish philosopher, because of his notion of God, was very much closer to what we would call Brahma in India, rather than the personal God that is very much in the Judeo-Christian tradition. He was condemned, excommunicated. His writings were burnt in the synagogue. First writings to be burnt anywhere were in the synagogue, not later on in the churches they were burnt. Clive's other writing. I mentioned all this, really, it's the religions that have created this problem because they don't want to listen to the observations. They just want to say, that's not what the Bible says. Right. Theory part of it.
Yeah.
Galileo even made this remark.
Okay.
Bible shows how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. Heavens there refer to the various planets, not how the heavens go, how to go to heaven. So I mentioned some of these things to really realize that to become so fanatically connected with this religious idea or that religious idea without really experiencing anything, basically then intellectually you condemn those who don't agree with you. Or in this case, if you're able, partly because in Christianity, secular and religious power were intertwined very early on, which is why if you look at from the 16th century onwards, the whole planet was ruled by people coming from Christian countries. Why?
They want more power.
No, but just try to see, because religious power and secular powers were intertwined. After Emperor Constantine, actually starting in the 4th century, it became more and more intertwined later. No one needs to really, the world history is going to be challenged again more, and people get upset by China wanting to become more important. Why not? China and India have been ancient civilizations for centuries. Why should they not be ruling the world? I mean, the USA just came into the picture 200 years ago. What's the big deal about that?
Well, no. I don't really see why anyone has to rule the world. Any one country has to rule the world. But I get what you're saying, and I don't think you get any argument from anyone on this meeting, in this meeting, on that. I don't think there are any, dyed-in-the-wool Christians who would argue what you're saying. But then what did Roshi Kabora, what was he referring to when he said they have to discover, science and spirituality need to discover their common origin?
Yes, because see, there the suggestion again and again is that whatever we mean by God is a subtle combination of truth, love, beauty, consciousness. Therefore, truth gets associated these days with science, and compassion or salvation, etc., gets associated with religion. From his point of view, they're all arising from the same one source, which is what practically all the sages would say. Whatever they mean by God has to do with, in fact, there is an interesting story in the Buddhist literature about beauty. Ananda, who was a great disciple of the Buddha, on one occasion was very struck by something very beautiful. So he said to the Buddha, Tathagat, that was a way of addressing the Buddha. Tathagat, it seems to me that beauty is next to spirituality. The Buddha said, no, Ananda, beauty is spirituality. This is a remark of the Buddha. So truth, beauty, love, compassion, consciousness, these are the very expressions, whatever we mean by God. And therefore, for Roshi Kabori to say that this notion of so-called science and religion, rather than being later on having to be brought together, one needs to see that they originate from the same source. Truth is what gets associated with science. Rather sadly, actually, personally, these days, because science is not the only avenue to truth. The Buddha did not know very much science. Krishnamurti did not know very much science. So, do they have no access to truth? Raman Maharshi did not know very much science. No, I say that the very idea of the word truth can itself become externalized. Science is dealing exclusively with externalized universe, not with the internal universe.
Yes.
So one needs to be really strongly both critical and also allowing people to enter everything. Every scientist, whenever, I already mentioned to you Newton and Einstein, two of the greatest ones, but you can, any of the great other scientists, more they know, the more they realize how little they know.
Yes. And the less they know, the more they think they know.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. Describing, I'd like to just read a small passage in the book. It says, one evening during the meditation, I had a strong feeling of letting go of all my scheming, thinking, fears, and pleasures, and being plunged into a vast, unknown ocean. I knew somewhere deep down that this was what I needed, that I needed to deeply trust the cosmos, God, Buddha, that, and the process of transformation and evolution. Trying to keep oneself isolated from the great movement is death. To participate in the great death is to let go and to participate in the great life. Now, the first, trying to keep oneself isolated from the great movement is capitalized, is death with a small d. And then to participate in the great death, capital D, is to let go and to participate in the great life.
Yes.
So I resonate very deeply with that statement, and because I think that if I'm interpreting correctly, the great death is the portal of every spiritual awakening. Yes. Has at some point saying yes to death.
Yes.
Right. So so that made me very happy to read that.
It's actually a reminder again and again. In fact, it used to be very common practice, especially in Christian and Buddhist monasteries. Whenever a monk met another, he would say, "Brother, remember death." Okay. And maybe this might interest some of you here. In the Mahabharata, the great text in India, an angelic spirit or celestial spirit is asking, what is the greatest mystery in the world? And the only answer that this spirit is willing to accept is that the greatest mystery is that everybody sees people around him dying, but nobody believes that he too will die. That is the great mystery in the world. But again and again, a reminder that whatever I call Ravi will die.
But there's the death before you die, right? That's what I'm referring to.
That can free one. There is a very great Sufi saying, if you die before you die, you will not die when you die.
Yes. That's what I'm talking about.
It's also on Mount Athos in a monastery from on Mount Athos. I saw that there, but I had earlier come across this in a Sufi saying.
Yes.
No, but as you can see, really, there are many things which, as I said earlier, are common to all great spiritual teachings, but there are differences. But the differences can be helpful. I mean, in a way, for example, Christ said, the Father and I are one. I have personally never heard anybody in India refer to God as the Father. That doesn't mean that one cannot refer to God in some other way. So why dismiss one expression? So sometimes I feel that the various religious teachings, partly because Christ is teaching to people of Jewish origin in Aramaic, Buddha is teaching to people of Hindu origin in Pali, the languages themselves are different. So they themselves create differences. So if one can actually acknowledge this, that the differences are only in the expressions of reality, not in reality, then one can be free. I actually I don't know whether I gave this example in this book, but in the history of physics, there was in the 1930s a great drama, whether at the fundamental level we have particles or we have waves, because the same thing in some experiments will behave like particles, in some experiments they will behave like waves. So it used to be more or less a joking way of saying in the physics laboratories that on Monday, Wednesday, Friday they were waves, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday they were particles, and on Sunday the Lord rested. Until later on, when the idea was proposed that neither the particle nor the wave completely describes this, but we need an experimental setup to measure anything, and that the experimental setup itself then ends up constricting one description or the other description. My impression is that cultural expressions are just like physics experimental setups. A cultural expression coming from the Abrahamic tradition naturally has certain underlying notions, underlying ideas, and other expressions coming from the Indian tradition have slightly different notions underlying. But if one can feel that none of the expressions really completely describe reality, but that the expressions are coming from cultural setup, and therefore one would not be getting so stuck with that particular expression or the other, and to allow to go beyond the expression. This has been really almost always the call by even the great scientists, like maybe I have more than once quoted Pascal. He said, heart has reason that reason does not know. First avenue to truth is actually feeling, heart. You look at any of the great scientists, they would say, they call intuition. They don't necessarily call it feeling, but intuition is a feeling. And so similarly, poets or any of the great sages, something touches their heart, then they wish to express it to the others, and language is needed, but the moment it gets expressed, it gets limited. So one needs to be very careful. How can I keep returning to allowing the mystery to actually remain a mystery, rather than now here is the complete explanation of this.
Yeah, trying to reach it intellectually.
That's right.
Right. Your descriptions of working with Madame de Salzmann and the things that she said, even how she said them, as I mentioned earlier before we started, they're so reminiscent of being with my teacher, Rudy. He had the same demands and the same instructions, often the same words, even the terminology. He never called what we did meditation. He always called it work.
Yes.
Meditation for many people is practiced as a means of soothing or escaping or finding peace, which is fine, but that's a different kind of meditation, right? And Jeanne de Salzmann and Rudy both emphasize that we are here to work, to relate the higher with the lower. And as Rudy said, the reward of work is more work, he would often say. And yet the other thing they have in common is the simultaneous emphasis on letting go, or in Rudy's word, surrender. Okay, that's where they use different words, but the same meaning, right? Which is equally important as the effort, right? So they both talked about working hard and letting go.
Yes.
And it's like a dance between conscious effort within the meditation, right? Conscious effort and conscious letting go or surrender.
Yes.
The initial effort, I think, takes us out of our ordinary consciousness of time and space so that we enter this eternal presence. And then once we're there, we have to let go to allow the higher energy to enter.
Yes.
And as our attention begins to fade, then we work again, and so on, right? And so it's this very creative process. Rudy often said it's a creative process. So
I'm glad you see resonance between what Madame de Salzmann said and what your teacher said.
Mm-hmm.
Because deep down, many, many things are really common. It's, of course, depends on where one is starting from. Not everybody starts from the same place, and one needs to begin from whatever one is. But this is just an amusing story. Maybe some of your people will be interested in this, because I used to go to Paris for about 5 to 6 weeks every year for about several years to work with Madame de Salzmann. And my colleagues in the physics department were occasionally wondering, why do I go to Paris? So, what I decided on one occasion, to speak to somebody, in every group, if you say to one person something, he will soon tell everybody. This happens in every group. So I knew one person like that. So I said to him in a whisper, I said, oh, don't say it to anybody, but I actually have a girlfriend in Paris. Soon, all of my physics colleagues were eager to help me to go there to meet my girlfriend in Paris, if you can believe this.
So,
I don't think I mentioned that in that book.
No, I don't remember reading that. Madame de Salzmann also talked about this quote that I wrote down, I think. If one is open to the vertical current, that is what makes the astral body. The other current, the horizontal one, is the energy of the physical body. One current is not at the cost of the other or in the place of the other. Without the vertical current, there is no meaning to existence. But without the other current of energy, no action is possible in the world. To be complete, a human being must relate with both currents. I agree. I totally agree with that. And to me, it's the symbol of the cross that predates Christianity, right? I'm not talking about the Christian cross, but the cross of vertical and horizontal, the vertical being the evolution of consciousness, the horizontal being relationship, right? And relating to our community, our loved ones, our friends, whoever, right? That's the action. That's the physical level, the action.
Yes.
And the vertical. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that?
But it is also really precisely because of that, one also has to realize that there is no reason to become against whatever we end up calling ego.
Mm-hmm.
I mention this partly because the word ego, especially from the beginning of the 20th century, by some people like Freud, etc., the word ego has been completely reduced to complete selfishness.
Mm.
The word ego simply comes from Greek, literally means self. For example, the remarks of Christ, I am the way, the truth, and the life, begin with ego eimi, I am. Ego simply means I or self. And I mention this simply because until one has a strong ego, there is nothing one can actually do as an action in the world. That doesn't mean that I have to be driven wholly by my ego. There is also this spiritual energy. Unless I connect with that, then it becomes selfish. But the action is not going to be undertaken other than by whatever I mean by the word ego, my body, by my mind. And therefore, there is no need to be against the ego. In fact, I sometimes remind people, even look at the people gathered right now here. Unless they had enough time, enough money, they cannot participate in any webinar of any interest to them. I actually often say this, that not to take it so literal-mindedly, but only the rich can practice poverty. The poor have no choice. Therefore, there is absolutely no need to be against the ego. In fact, Jeanne de Salzmann, maybe I quoted this in this book also, one of her remarks, I return to this very often. Ego is a good servant, but a bad master. Who needs a servant who wants to just lie around doing nothing? But if the servant begins to make all the decisions in the house, then that can be a problem. So ego is a good servant, but a bad master. I return to this expression quite often. There is no need to be against the ego. It is needed to accomplish anything in life.
Yes, I think Einstein, I'm trying to find it. Yes, Einstein had a quote or said, the intuitive mind is a sacred gift and the rational mind is a faithful servant. Yes. We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift.
That's right.
So it's a matter of keeping them in perspective, right?
Yes.
In proportion.
Yes.
Right? When the ego becomes the master, then we're in trouble. But we can train the ego. And when it's a servant, it helps us to get things done.
Yes. No, I agree. See, the thing is, quite rightly, both you and I, we end up quoting great scientists or poets because then people give more credibility to it. Otherwise, in fact, even an ordinary person like myself can actually come to this understanding.
Yes.
But that doesn't necessarily give more credibility to it if Ravi says so. If Einstein says so, yeah, people would listen to this.
Well, I would give more credibility if you said so.
Well, no,
Let's
but
see
what I more meant to say is that really we need to realize these things in our own life, even at whatever level we are, that we are being constantly blessed by many, many mysterious forces and energies, and sometimes also challenged by them. It's not only always blessed in the usual sense of the word, but if I take the word blessing really more to mean being touched by them, this is almost a constant situation in my judgment. Every day is a great mystery. But sometimes one is very much struck by something. Sometimes one is helped by something. Sometimes one feels as if something is interfering with me. But still to realize that the whole universe is not organized around me. There are 2 trillion galaxies in the world, universe.
Perhaps we should open it up for questions from the audience. So again, make sure that if you want to ask a question out loud, have your video on. If you don't want to have your video on, then you can type your question or your comment in the chat and I will read it. And there is something in the chat right now. Sri Devi asked, please share more about your dialogues with Krishnamurti. I think she's referring to.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or Krishnaji, as we used to call him. Yeah.
Krishnaji.
Well, my dialogue, Krishna, I met him hundreds of times over 20 years. So what should I be sharing? That's what I write.
The essence of what you feel the West should know about. Because I too have sat at his feet for, over 30 years. And before I came and settled in the West. So I would love to know, your, if you didn't have to think about it, just, the major impact he has made on, ways of thinking and perceiving, and what you also see as some of the fusion between his words and what we know from the Upanishads, the way of self-inquiry, which he was so keen about and was constantly scolding us to do more. But, your own impact for you personally.
One of the emphasis that he very much brought, that really everything very much depends on each one of us in our own life. And it's not a question of following this teaching or this way or that way, or this scripture or that scripture. To look inside. Repeatedly, he speaks about impartial self-inquiry. Mm-hmm. And the difficulty that I actually felt about Krishnamurti, maybe I should say that a little bit here. He always spoke as it were from the level of Mount Everest. Mm-hmm. And I'm not quite sure that he even heard anybody else speaking from a low level.
Yeah.
The reason I'm saying this, because I am at a very low level. How do I start climbing? To speak about what one sees from Mount Everest is wonderful. It can be nourishing. Certainly in his presence, I can assure you, I was always feeling uplifted internally.
Yeah.
Yeah. But then one goes home and it's the same life. The reason I'm saying this, after all, I have known people who had met Krishnamurti over 50 years and have been reading all his books, but I don't see any change in their life. Because no particular practice was being emphasized by Krishnamurti.
Yeah, being the perceiver, to
always speaking, as I said, from very high level. And of course, if and when one could impartially even look at oneself for a little while, something changes. Because as I have repeatedly tried to say, self-awareness is actually the mechanism of self-transformation.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I don't know any other mechanism of transformation personally.
Right.
And so, in a way, impartial self-study, self-inquiry is clearly important. But since no particular gatherings were being emphasized by him, although later on in his life he started saying it's good for people to come together and speak with each other.
Yeah.
But earlier he would even say, oh, you can give up your job, or this.
Right.
Nice, because he had all kinds of money being given to him by other people.
Yes.
But so in a way, I am a great admirer of Krishnamurti, but I often had all kinds of questions with him. And questions really largely had to do with, maybe, in fact, I described this in this very book there. Mm-hmm. One of the remarks of mine that has very much struck him, I don't want to go into the details of, I had written to him in a letter, okay, I can accept there is no way from here to there, but is there a way from there to here?
Mm.
And he said, that's what I've been teaching for the last 60 years.
Right.
So if there is a way from there to here, how do I connect with that way?
It's again the power of grace.
Exactly.
And our readiness, it brings us back to what you originally said. And also leads me to my comment on Sri Aurobindo and his work on what he called the descent of the supramental consciousness. So he too was focused on the way from there to here.
Yeah.
Yes. But one of the things, with the major difference between the two of them, Krishnamurti is happy to just give up this world, leave this, go over there. Aurobindo was more interested in actually spiritualizing the material world.
Yes. Well said.
Yes. So and Jeanne de Salzmann also talked about the integration of body and mind, right?
Yes. Otherwise, the earth will fall down. Very strong emphasis. So that the material world itself needs to be spiritualized was actually the major emphasis of Aurobindo. Yes. Radically different from most of the sages in India, especially different from Shankara, who kept saying Brahma Satya Jagat Mithya. Only Brahma is true. The whole manifested universe is illusion. Aurobindo was very much against that whole idea. In fact, he called Shankara that medieval philosopher.
Well, which is also true. He was a medieval philosopher. Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
Anybody else wishes to bring something, please do.
Yeah,
it doesn't have to be a question to me. If you wish to bring your own insight, please do so.
Right.
The book is available.
Through
it to me, Ravindra at ravindra.ca. That's my email.
What is it again?
Ravindra at ravindra.ca. On my website, which is simply ravindra.ca, CA for Canada, not .com. Mm-hmm. There you have many articles, many videos, etc., and many forthcoming public events. Some of them may.
So I have a question from Lorraine. Any thoughts about the order in which to read your books?
Well, there are people who, of course, have read or heard about Krishnamurti. They first of all want to read that. There are others who have heard about Gurdjieff teaching. They want to read what I say about Madame de Salzmann. Or some people are Buddhist, Zen Buddhism oriented, so they want to read that. personally, for me, I'm just deeply describing my life's journey, really, there, from the beginning to the end. So, in a way, you could look at the contents, but don't have to necessarily read every word in that. But then from the contents, you can get an idea of what engages you or what might interest you, possibly. Essentially, I describe as a young boy, more or less, really, not my wish to become an engineer, but it was just expected. If you're a good student, that's what you should do. In fact, Jawaharlal Nehru, who was our prime minister at that time, when that Indian Institute of Technology was started, this is what he said at the inauguration of that institute. These institutes will be the temples of New India. This is Jawaharlal Nehru's remark. So in a way, there was a very strong emphasis that good students should all go into engineering, etc. And so that's how I ended up there, but doing a Master of Technology, but not satisfied. So in a way, I'm partly just describing, I'm not against technology or against science or against anything. It's silly to be against anything. Everything has its place in the world. But question is, for a searcher, what is it? Where am I now? What do I need?
Yeah, Rose wanted to know what is the book about St. John, the Gospel of John?
What is the name of the book?
What is the name of the book on the Gospel of John?
Okay. It was initially published in England as the Yoga of the Christ. The word yoga meaning, in that context, the way or the teaching or the method of Christ. But some publisher, it was translated into dozens of languages. And some for example, in French, Spanish, Portuguese, they kept the same title. But in some languages, they did not want to keep the title with yoga and Christ in it. In fact, this might surprise some of you. The publisher in Greek wrote to me that if he uses the word yoga and Christ in the same title, the church will burn his publishing house down. It's in writing by him.
Yes.
So they changed the title to something like Symbolism in the Gospel of John. In USA also, they did not want to publish it like this. So initially, they published it as Christ the Yogi, which completely surprised me. But see, unless you're a famous author, the publisher can do whatever the hell they want to do. They don't ask the authors. So we objected to this. Then next time they brought it out under the Gospel of John in the Light of Indian Mysticism. That's the title of the book in USA. The Gospel of John in the Light of Indian Mysticism. So the titles are different here, there, but then in India it was republished as the Yoga of the Christ. So that's the original title.
Okay. There's a comment by Miguel, who happens to be my brother. It sounds like Ravi Ravindra has led a rich and diverse spiritual journey, drawing inspiration from various sources and encounters with significant teachers. Ravi's autobiography likely reflects the profound impact of teachings from traditions like Theosophy, Zen, Sufi, Indian traditions, and Esoteric Christianity on his life and search for spiritual understanding. It's clear that Ravi deeply appreciates the influence of these teachings and the guidance of wise individuals he has encountered along the way. Ravi's gratitude to the mysterious forces guiding the cosmos indicates a deep sense of spiritual connection and appreciation for the blessings in his life.
Oh, that's very nice comment, sir. Thank you very much.
Yeah. And Maria put the Gospel of John in the Light of Indian Mysticism in the chat. She has a picture of it.
Yes.
And it's on Amazon. And Christ the Yogi. The book that I remember seeing, or that you presented on, was the Yoga of the Christ. Is that the same book?
Yeah, the Yoga of the Christ.
Okay. Yeah.
That's the original title.
Okay. Well, because that's on Amazon.
Yeah.
So the Gospel of John in the Light of Indian Mysticism is the same book as the Yoga of the Christ.
That's right.
Okay. Just wanted to clarify.
Minor little changes, but nothing worthwhile. I mean, just some corrections of some commas here or there. But don't worry about that.
Any other questions or comments?
I would just say I really enjoyed this evening, so thank you so very much.
You're very welcome. No, I personally keep saying it's not that I'm trying to sell these books, but the book can invite you to actually investigate some mysteries in your own life. You'll be surprised how we often don't think about it like this, but many, many forces are playing in our lives. Who you end up meeting, who you end up getting married to, who your children happen to be, why are they born of you rather than of somebody else. And in fact, certainly in the Indian tradition, very strong idea, actually probably true in every tradition. I remember on one occasion, my daughter, when she was about 12 years old, she was very mad at me, crying, I mean, tears coming horizontally from her. I didn't ask to be born of you, she said to me. I had to tell her that it is not her choice to be born of me. That there are very large forces are at play.
Well, isn't in Theosophy, as well as certainly in Spiritism, they teach that we do make these decisions and choices prior to incarnation.
Yes.
When we're in the spirit world.
Yeah,
right?
Very much.
Yeah. Based on the choices, based on what we need to learn or what we decide to learn in this next incarnation. So we choose the circumstances and the parents and a lot of the incidents in our life that are designed to help us to learn.
And the underlying idea is that really these forces are trying to assist you to follow your journey.
Yes.
Not to get distracted.
Sharon, you have a question?
Yes.
Unmute.
Jeremiah.
Okay.
Oh,
yeah. Hi.
I see Sharon's hand up.
It's more of a comment. So I really enjoyed the part of the bringing the science and spirituality together to their common source. And I just grew up with a father who was a scientist, and he came from unusual background, immigrants to Canada from the Ukraine. And he grew up in a small farming town, Spedden, Alberta, and he was set to be a farmer. And one day he was picking rocks in the field and said, "I'm done with this." And he went off and went to college with very, very little traditional education, and became one of the great ozone researchers. And so I interviewed him once and said, how did you come upon doing this? And he said when he was a young boy, he would lie on his back in the field looking at the stars, and he just really connected with the nature and the appreciation he had for, the wildlife and the natives that he grew up next to, the Native Americans, I guess, and the stars. And he ended up just loving the clear skies, and that when the Industrial Revolution came around and the pollution began to be a thing, he got very concerned for humanity and this is back in the 50s. And he devoted his life then. And I said, well, how did you do that? And it was a spiritual connection he had with sort of nature that led him to take the actions to want to create something to help mankind, so it sort of was it brought it all together for him. And he kind of he grew up sort of Greek Orthodox and became Presbyterian, but he said he just kind of had his own religion, his own sense of spirituality. So he did follow his spirit in taking his scientific actions.
That's great. Wonderful story.
Yeah. Thank you.
Jeremiah, please.
You know, I have heard you mention several times before, and when you have led certain contemplations, the statement, I did not create myself. So why am I here? What am I here for? I find that oftentimes for myself, I will awake during the night and there's no stimuli, and I will realize that there is the presence of life going on inside of me that I have no control over. It's making my heart beat. It's making all my physiology work. It has no name to it. It's just a presence. I happen to be an osteopath and a priest. In the depth of traditional osteopathy, we don't look at the human being as being built up out of material pieces, but rather as the soul incarnating and leading the development of the anatomy and the physiology. So my appeal is, I would like you to comment on when, if that be the case, certainly we didn't create ourselves, and yet we did create ourselves. So there is a depth of connection there with a divine source. So how to get the most clarity on what is the mission then for a particular person that flows out of the depth of that unity. I hope that makes some sense.
Yes. No, I think it's a very important question, actually. So let's spend a few minutes on it. First of all, rather than even getting stuck with one expression or the other, but underlying ideas that we have, obviously, as you reminded again and again, I often say, I did not create myself. And that the suggestion from all the sages is that it's spiritual energies, we could call it God, spirit, whatever, has created the whole universe, including you and I. And then the implication is that every level of creation obviously has different level of consciousness, different level of understanding. I often assume, I'm hoping that the mosquitoes may have a little less consciousness than I do, assuming that that is true, that each level is wishing to return home, come back to the source, come back to God. And so that spiritual energy, divine energy, if you like, has taken on my body. It's not that my body has taken on the divine energy, it's the other way around. As you just actually said yourself, it's that divine energy which has created this body as its instrument to assist this, whatever level it now is in me, what we call soul, to assist it to come to a higher level, to the level of the spirit. I should here make a remark which surprises me. Sometimes people don't remember that the word for soul and spirit are two different words in the New Testament. They have got all mixed up since the 16th century, since Descartes mostly, because he actually equates them and equates them with mind, believe it or not. But otherwise, soul, your soul is different from my soul. These are personal. Spirit is transpersonal. And the suggestion is that this soul needs to evolve, and in order to evolve, it needs to undertake appropriate actions. Therefore, it needs a body and a mind to take those actions. A great Christian theologian long time ago makes this remark: God became man so that man may become God.
Mm-hmm.
That is the call. So, in a way, then of course the trouble is this soul in me, whatever level it is in, can get wholly occupied or be driven by my bodily needs and fears and desires. We can look around at the whole world, look at ourselves impartially. Most of the time, whatever you get as spam mail, what are they trying to sell? Or the temptations that every great sages had to deal with. For example, the Buddha was tested by Mara. Christ is tested by the Satan. What is the test? Power, wealth, pleasure. And the other side is the fear, death. So, in a way, this is a universal situation. But the call, why this spiritual energy? So first of all, if I begin to actually see two in me, now different words get used. For example, St. Paul says in the New Testament, we have a spiritual nature and we have a carnal nature. That's one way of saying it. My own teacher, Jeanne de Salzmann, used to say, we have an angelic nature and an animal nature. Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita has a very strong expression. We have a demonic nature and we have a divine nature. So sometimes it gets written as self with a capital S and self with a small s. But whichever way you have, but the idea is if I can actually begin to see two in me, one is being driven by all the forces of the world, but that is also the force, the energy that can undertake some action in the world. We can call it the ego, if you like, or the small s self. And the other part is wishing to evolve, to return back to the same level as the divine spirit. Now, in human history, probably extremely few people have actually come to that level. So Christ could actually say, the Father and I are one. The Buddha could say, look within, you are the Buddha. Or in the Upanishads, I am Brahma. So it is possible, obviously, some great sages have said that, and not said, even a fool like me can use these words. I don't mean just saying the words. I mean to actually manifest that reality. But I think that my impression is that that is a very rare achievement. But that is the overall call. At least then, especially in the tradition like India, where reincarnation is emphasized, the suggestion is that in successive reincarnations or successive incarnations, you can come a little closer and closer to this. Even the Buddha took many lifetimes to become enlightened. So it's not that it's going to happen quickly. If even he took many lifetimes. Of course, the trouble is once it gets organized in a religion, for example, nothing is ever mentioned about Christ searching for anything. Nothing is known about him since after the age of about 14 to 30. which is the time when any human being will be searching for something. So part of the trouble is the religions just want to indicate certain things and not indicate that any search is required. But that is where it's very helpful to look at some of the other traditions. Then one cannot be against the search or against this or that. But ultimately, it is all a divine blessing. I think everybody would agree to that.
And the goal being to bring the small s self into alignment with the capital S self.
Yes.
Right?
That's the call.
Yeah. Maria has her hand up, and we're just about out of time, Maria. So if you have a quick question, go ahead and ask it.
I don't have quick questions. One of them could be quick. The first one was, you were talking about your book and obtaining answers to the questions of the mysteries of life. And so my question was, when you made those questions to yourself, did your answers come to you in dreams, in visions, in a gnosis? Like, how did you attain certainty to your answers? That was my first one.
Answers are not something that can be written down or that this is the answer to my question. No, as I have been repeatedly saying, that the mystery gets deepened more and more, and that I feel more willing and I hope able also to welcome these large forces and to embrace them and to be touched by them and possibly helped by them. But so the mysteries really remain. That's my very strong impression.